Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the Voice of Reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So today, we continue to hear about the prospect of a major Ukrainian operation, quite possibly, against the Russian land bridge, the territory that it controls, running from just south of Zaporizhia down towards Mariupol, Melitopol, and to the Crimean Peninsula. So the idea is that the Ukrainian army, at some point, is going to have the capability of launching an offensive operation that would sever this land corridor, creating an environment where Russia would only be able to supply its forces in Crimea through the Kerch Straits, through this area. And we know from prior incidents that the Ukrainian military has the ability to attack the Kerch Strait bridge in this area. It's been done. So then what? Let's hypothetically say that the Ukrainians mount a very large offensive operation designed to sever this land corridor. So first, it's going to be an incredibly large, incredibly tough, conventional fight. And it's unknown if, one, the Ukrainians could launch such an offensive against the Russian forces in this area, much less be successful in pushing Russian forces, defeating Russian forces in the field, in areas north of Mariupol and within the vicinity of Melitopol. This area here is going to be a key target for that Ukrainian offensive operation. Obviously, you have a multitude of roads and rail junctions leading into Melitopol. Now, what are the Russians going to do? Are the Russians going to allow a successful Ukrainian military operation to cut the land corridor to Crimea? No, they're not. They're going to do everything in their power conventionally to prevent that from happening, to include launching operations on additional fronts. Not just the Donbass area, but possible look in areas near Belgorod, Sumy, Chernihiv, and even further to the west along the Belarusian-Ukrainian border. Now, if that doesn't prevent a successful Ukrainian operation, how would the Russians prevent the Ukrainians from said successful military operation of cutting the land corridor to Crimea? Well, the Russians, in all probability, would resort to the use of tactical nuclear weapons. I don't believe that it is an option for the Russians to lose the land corridor to Crimea. Thus, if they had to use tactical nuclear weapons, they absolutely would. Now, what's interesting with war is once a weapon is used, it tends to be continued to use. Now, what I mean by that is, in all probability, we would see one, maybe two tactical nuclear weapons be deployed by Russian forces. Then what is the West going to do? Well, there's not a lot the West can do at that point. They could declare maybe a no-fly zone. They could start to assist the Ukrainians directly with air power. But again, that would lead to a direct confrontation, a direct military engagement between Russian forces and NATO United States. So in all likelihood, we won't see that occur, even if the Russians use tactical nuclear weapons. Now, once the Russians use tactical nuclear weapons, in all probability, they will continue to use tactical nuclear weapons. So it won't be just one nuclear weapon. And what I'm talking about are 0.5, 1 kiloton nuclear devices. Now, as these nuclear weapons are used, the Russians will continue to up the ante until they crush the Ukrainians. And they'll continue to use these nuclear weapons until they have, at least to their perception, have broken the back of the Ukrainian military. Now, therein lies again the problem. What happens then? Does the West, does NATO allow a total Ukrainian military defeat through the use of Russian nuclear weapons? It's difficult to say. And that's again where this gets tricky, and we can't predict the future. We don't know how things will escalate, how things will transition into a direct war between Russia and the West. Look, right now, Russia is preparing for that eventuality. We continue to see the mobilization of Russian personnel. We are seeing the expansion of the Russian military-industrial complex. Russia right now is looking at a very long war. It is preparing for a very long war. It is starting to produce drones, more and more cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles for use against Ukrainian targets. Compounding that, these systems that the Russians are starting to produce and field in ever-growing numbers, especially these kamikaze drones, these Iranian designed drone systems, the Shahed 136, cost the Russians about $20,000 to produce that system. Now, to shoot, for instance, one of these drones down, it costs the Ukrainians 3 to 10 times more than that actual drone costs. And it doesn't cost the Ukrainians that, it costs the United States that, Western allies that cost. The missiles that are being used to shoot down the Iranian supply drones, which will soon be Russian produced drones, which we're already starting to see. Russia has its own drone capability. These systems are much less costly than the air defense missiles that are used to shoot these systems down. So again, war in perpetuity, Russians are preparing for it. Again, the size and scope of the mobilization inside of Russia indicates that they are preparing to fight a multi-year war. Now, in the United States, there are elections. There is the changing political opinion. The United States is not going to continue to supply the Ukrainians in perpetuity with billions and billions of dollars in weapon systems. It's not going to do it. Eventually, it's going to stop. Then what? Now, the problem right now for the Ukrainians is they have angered the Russian bear, the Russian Federation, to such an extent that right now it looks like the Russians may continue this until they have militarily defeated the Ukrainians. This could go beyond just taking certain areas to the eventual goal of seizing of control of Kiev. Again, I think the first step for Russia is to seize all land east of the Dnieper River. I think that right now is a war goal, war aim. I think at this point, the idea of a Ukrainian counteroffensive is going to really play into the hands of the Russian military. I would suspect that if the Russians foresaw a Ukrainian offensive, that they were going to prepare for that and use that to create horrendous casualties against the Ukrainian military. We know what happened in the Kharkov operation, and to a lesser extent in the operation that took place on the western bank of the Dnieper River when the Ukrainians moved into Kherson. But the Russians could be laying a trap for the Ukrainians, especially if they allow a certain amount of breakthrough operations to occur, especially in Zaporizhia, north of Melitopol. That could be the opportunity that Russia would then turn to tactical nuclear weapons. I don't believe if Russia uses tactical nuclear weapons, if you look at the cost-benefit analysis, what is the West going to do? I don't know if there is much that the West could do outside of turning this into a shooting war between the West and Russia, which again could very likely happen at some point. But again, this war is far from over. It looks to continue. The Russians look right now as if they plan on continuing operations in perpetuity. And again, this year, next year, and beyond. All the rhetoric that is coming out of the Kremlin indicates they have no desire to stop this conflict at any point. So then again, you have to look at war goals and war aims and what do the Russians ultimately want to accomplish. And my fear is at this point that the point of no return has been crossed for the current Ukrainian state, meaning that Russia believes at this point it cannot coexist with the current Ukrainian state. And all the casualties that have been caused in this conflict, all the bad blood that has been created in this conflict is just going to continue to throw gasoline onto the fire. Hence, the war will continue. And in this sort of war of attrition, it is going to be difficult for the Ukrainians, because what is happening now is going to look a lot different than what happens in the future, 1 year, 2 years from now. So we're going to continue to watch what happens on the ground. We are continuing to watch very, very closely the front lines, Seversk, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and other areas as well. Again, as summer approaches, things are going to start heating up quite a bit more than where they're at now. Again, essentially a static war that may become a war of maneuver in the very near future. And we'll keep our eye on it, and we'll continue to report and bring content for your consumption. Again, thank you for joining us today. More to come.